Tokyo, April 11th, 1951. Inside the American ambassador's residence, the calm of a midday meal is shattered by a radio bulletin. An announcer's voice cuts through the music. President Truman has relieved General of the Army Douglas MacArthur of all his commands. In the next room, Jean MacArthur stands frozen. She then walks to the dining table where her husband, the celebrated victor of the Pacific War, is finishing his lunch, oblivious. She is the one who must deliver the news. The official, encrypted order from the President of the United States is still hours away, lost in a cascade of transmission failures. This was more than just a clumsy dismissal. It was the explosive climax of a constitutional crisis that had been building for months, pitting America's most revered general against his commander-in-chief. At stake was not just the fate of Korea, but a potential nuclear World War III with China and the Soviet Union. It forced a fundamental question. In a democracy at war, who holds the ultimate authority? The soldier fighting the war, or the elected leader who must answer for it? To understand the answer, we must return to the moment their two worlds first collided. Their worlds first collided not in a tense Oval Office meeting, but in the desperate heat of the Korean summer of 1950. The war was a catastrophe. North Korean armies, trained and supplied by the Soviets, had stormed across the 38th parallel, routing unprepared South Korean and American forces. By August, UN troops were trapped in a shrinking perimeter around the port of Pusan, their backs to the Korea Strait, on the verge of being pushed into the sea. From his headquarters in Tokyo, General MacArthur conceived a masterstroke, an operation so audacious the Pentagon's top brass considered it reckless, an amphibious assault at Inchon, hundreds of miles behind enemy lines. The port had some of the world's most extreme tides and was defended by high seawalls. The Joint Chiefs of Staff warned it was a 5,000-to-1 gamble. On September 15th, MacArthur took that gamble and won. The landing was a stunning success. The North Korean People's Army was shattered, its supply lines severed. Seoul was liberated. MacArthur, already a living legend, now appeared infallible. And it was this spectacular victory that sowed the seeds of a new crisis. For the Truman administration, the objective was containment. The goal was to restore the original border and prevent a wider war, especially with a newly communist China. This was the cold, pragmatic doctrine of the nuclear age, a limited war. But MacArthur was a general forged by World War II. For him, war had only one acceptable outcome: total victory and unconditional surrender. He saw containment as political cowardice, a failure of will that invited future aggression. The war wasn't over until the enemy was annihilated. As UN forces crossed the 38th parallel and drove deep into North Korea, diplomatic channels buzzed with Chinese warnings. Washington grew anxious. MacArthur remained supremely confident. On October 15, 1950, President Truman flew thousands of miles to a remote Pacific outpost, Wake Island, to meet his celebrated commander. He needed assurance. He asked MacArthur directly, "What are the chances for Chinese or Soviet interference?" The general's reply, recorded in the official transcript, was unequivocal: very little. He then promised the president the war would be won by Thanksgiving, and the troops would be home by Christmas. On November 24, 1950, MacArthur launched his Home by Christmas offensive, a final push to the Yalu River. But in the frozen mountains of North Korea, something was waiting. Something his intelligence had completely, catastrophically missed. For weeks, under the cover of darkness, a ghost army had been assembling. Over 300,000 Chinese soldiers, officially designated People's Volunteers, to maintain a thin veil of deniability, had secretly crossed the Yalu, unheard and unseen. On the night of November 25th, the trap was sprung. Bugles echoed through the icy passes, and a human wave attack crashed into the overextended UN columns. The front didn't bend, it shattered. The triumphant advance became a desperate, brutal flight south. In sub-zero temperatures, UN troops were thrown into the longest retreat in American military history. MacArthur's strategy wasn't just wrong. It was invalidated in the most devastating way possible. The war he thought he had won was now a completely new, far deadlier conflict. And in Washington, the trust was broken. The president who had taken his general's word now saw him as reckless and dangerously mistaken. The stage was set for a direct confrontation. By early 1951, the catastrophic retreat had ended. A new front line, forged in blood and ice, stabilized roughly along the 38th parallel, the original border. For the Truman administration, this brutal stalemate was, paradoxically, a strategic opportunity. The original war aim, repelling the invasion, had been achieved. Now was the time for diplomacy. But General MacArthur did not see a stalemate. He saw a failure of will. A man whose entire career was built on decisive victory could not accept the concept of a limited war. So, he decided to change the war himself. He began a public relations campaign from his Tokyo headquarters, issuing a stream of communiques and giving interviews to friendly journalists. His demands were radical and public: a complete naval blockade of the Chinese coast, the bombing of China's industrial heartland in Manchuria, and, most explosively, unleashing the 800,000 nationalist Chinese soldiers of Chiang Kai-shek from Taiwan to open a second front. These were not just military suggestions. They were policies the White House had explicitly and repeatedly forbidden, fearing they would trigger a global war with the Soviet Union. What MacArthur fundamentally misread was not just his own government, but his new enemy. For Mao Zedong, the UN advance to the Yalu River was an existential threat to his newly founded People's Republic. He feared an American-led invasion aimed at reversing the Chinese Civil War. The intervention in Korea was a desperate, preemptive strike to secure a buffer zone and protect Manchuria, the industrial engine of his new state. Mao and his commanders were fully prepared to absorb staggering casualties, pitting their immense manpower against American firepower to fight the world's superpower to a standstill. It was a resolve born of revolution, a resolve MacArthur dismissed as a bluff. In Washington, the frustration with their rogue general boiled over. On December 6, 1950, acting on the president's orders, the Joint Chiefs of Staff sent a directive to MacArthur and all other theater commanders. It was a direct, unambiguous order. It stated that no commander was to make any public statement on foreign or military policy without first getting clearance from Washington. It was a gag order, a formal command to be silent. The message was clear: you are a general, not a Secretary of State. For 3 months, an uneasy quiet held. Then, in March 1951, the Truman administration prepared its most significant diplomatic move of the war. A carefully worded proposal for a ceasefire was being drafted, an overture to the Chinese to begin negotiations. It was a moment of supreme delicacy. The proposal was scheduled for release in a matter of days. And that is when MacArthur struck. On March 24th, without any warning to Washington, he issued his own public ultimatum directly to the Chinese military command. It was a masterpiece of defiance. He belittled China as a military power, claiming its forces were on the verge of collapse. He then threatened to expand the war and bring China to the brink of military ruin if it did not immediately surrender to him on the battlefield. The peace initiative was dead before it was ever announced. Beijing could not be seen to negotiate under a public threat from an American general. In the White House, the news was received with cold fury. President Truman wrote in his private diary, "General MacArthur in this statement has challenged the authority of the President as Commander-in-Chief. It is in open defiance of my orders." This is a most extraordinary statement for a military commander of a theater to make. The general had not just disobeyed an order, he had sabotaged a presidential peace effort in wartime. But MacArthur had one final move. Joseph Martin, the Republican leader in the House of Representatives and a fierce critic of Truman, had written to the general, asking for his candid thoughts on the administration's strategy. MacArthur wrote back. In a letter dated March 20th, he again condemned the limited war policy, arguing that Asia was the new decisive theater in the global struggle against communism. He ended with a line that would become a rallying cry for his supporters. As you point out, we must win. There is no substitute for victory. On April 5, 1951, Congressman Martin stood on the floor of the House of Representatives and read the general's letter into the public record. The story was an immediate national sensation. MacArthur's private criticism was now an open political declaration, an alliance with the president's domestic opposition. He had not merely questioned a strategy, he had challenged the very foundation of American civil-military relations. For President Truman, the issue was no longer a disagreement over how to fight a war. It was about who was in charge of the United States. But firing a living legend, a man polls showed was more popular than the president himself, was a political gamble of monumental proportions. The political risk was almost unthinkable. In the spring of 1951, polls showed Douglas MacArthur was one of the most admired men in the nation. President Truman's own approval rating, meanwhile, had collapsed to just 23%. To fire the hero of the Pacific felt like political suicide, an act that could tear the country apart. But there was a deeper, more dangerous question. What if the military itself refused to accept the order? Before Truman could act, he He had to answer that question in absolute secrecy. He needed to know where the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the heads of the Army, Navy, and Air Force, would stand. Would they rally behind their fellow five-star general, a living legend of their own institution? Or would they support their commander-in-chief, a deeply unpopular civilian president, and uphold the Constitution? On April 6th, the question was put to them. One by one, the chiefs gave their solemn, private counsel. They were unanimous. General MacArthur's actions constituted a pattern of insubordination that threatened the entire chain of command. They would support the president's decision to relieve him. With his military flank now secure, Truman had the institutional backing he needed. The final decision could now be made. On the morning of April 10th, President Truman convened his senior advisors. In the room were Secretary of State Dean Acheson, Defense Secretary George Marshall, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Omar Bradley. Truman presented MacArthur's letter to Congressman Martin as the final act of defiance. He went around the room. Each man agreed. The decisive military verdict came from Bradley. He stated that MacArthur's public campaign of insubordination was now a direct threat to the constitutional principle of civilian control over the military. With their unanimous backing, Truman made the call. As he later recalled, his thinking was blunt. The son of a bitch isn't going to resign on me. I want him fired. But the execution of the order descended into chaos. The official message, sent through secure Army signal channels, was bogged down by a series of transmission errors. Meanwhile, the story had already leaked to the Washington press. Realizing they had lost the race, the White House was forced to make a public announcement just after 1 a.m. And so, the news reached the American ambassador's residence in Tokyo not through an encrypted military dispatch, but on the crackle of a commercial radio broadcast, 2 hours before the formal order would finally reach MacArthur's desk. The general was fired, but the battle for the future of American democracy had just begun. Douglas MacArthur returned home not in disgrace, but to a thunderous welcome. In New York, an estimated 7.5 million people turned out for the largest ticker-tape parade in the city's history. Before a joint session of Congress, he delivered his defiant, now immortal address, concluding, "Old soldiers never die, they just fade away." The public outcry against President Truman was deafening, but in the quiet of Senate hearings that followed, the narrative began to fracture. The key testimony came from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Omar Bradley. Asked for the military's assessment of MacArthur's plan to attack China, Bradley's answer was chillingly clear. It would involve us in the wrong war, at the wrong place, at the wrong time, and with the wrong enemy. With those words, the argument shifted from patriotism to the cold reality of global strategy, the risk of a nuclear confrontation with the Soviet Union. The question was no longer about a general's honor, but about his judgment. The general won the parades, but the president won the argument, cementing a precedent that would define the limits of military power in the nuclear age.